Let's move on to Truelsen Elbæk on material scarcity and unethical economic behavior. So, in very interesting ways, we see research coming out of Department of Management that are directly tying into these questions about sustainability and ethical and unethical decisions. Yes, Christian, please take us away.
Yeah, I'll share my slides just a sec. So do you see my slides now?
Yep.
All right, all good. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'll today talk about a systematic review and meta-analysis that entails a relationship on material scarcity and unethical economic behavior. And I'll just like to start out saying thank you to IMC because this was only possible to do based on the seed funding. So let's go ahead. So as I said, I'll talk about this meta-analysis, thematic review and meta-analysis today, entitled Material Scarcity and Unethical Economic Behavior. We have finalized the paper for this project and sent it to Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science because this journal had a special issue on scarcity and the societal implications of scarcity. So we thought that that was a good fit, but of course, waiting to see whether we were right about that. And just to be totally transparent, I would also like to mention that I actually also got seed funding together with my collaborators on another project, which is a lab experiment that investigates effects of acute hunger on unethical economic behavior. But as you might expect, due to the COVID pandemic, we have not been able to collect any data at all for this project yet. Luckily, we decided to make this project as a registered report, which has received conditional acceptance in Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. So when we actually have data for this project, I'll be so happy to come back and talk about what we found. But let's get our head back to the meta-analysis. So the motivation for this meta-analysis on a broad level is that unethical behavior conceptualized as any form of economic, I'll start that over again. Conceptualized as any form of economic outcome that occurs through immoral action has detrimental consequences in the world of today. So we probably all know these big scandals like the Volkswagen diesel scandal or our own Danske Bank's involvement in money laundering for some of the world's worst criminals, because these are often the examples that make it to the news headlines. But what's very important to understand here is that the aggregated effects of small-scale unethical economic behavior can have equally or even more detrimental consequences for societies and stakeholders. So for instance, only in the US, small-scale crimes such as shoplifting, employee theft, and faulty inventory accounting cost the retail industry $62 billion just in 2020. So this is a real big problem. And due to that, a large amount of research from different disciplines such as marketing, psychology, and behavioral economics have for the past 1 or 2 decades done extensive research into uncovering why individuals decide to engage in this kind of behavior. And at its core, it seems that this is often a basic conflict between the temptation to behave dishonestly and this capacity to resist that temptation. What has also been shown is that this relationship can be shifted based on different contextual factors or personality traits, etc. And based on that, an amount of research have recently started to look into how a lack of material resources, so that's a lack of water, a lack of food, lack of money, etc., affects this relationship. And this comes on the basis of research on how scarcity affects general decision-making behaviors. So there's been studies showing that scarcity, for instance, impedes cognitive functions when individuals are aware of their lack of resources. It's been shown to lower fluid intelligence and executive functioning. There's also been studies showing that when individuals are experiencing scarcity, they start to discount the future much more, so become much more aware of getting these short-term gratifications. And in connection to that, also engage in more impulsive and risk-taking decision-making behavior. And what's important here in regards to general effects of scarcity is that scholars have argued that all of these effects that comes from scarcity are independent of the type of scarcity in question. So whether the current scarcity is experienced as a lack of food or water or financial resources, this effect will lead to similar cognitive and behavioral outcomes across the different types of scarcity. So it basically prescribes this idea that the cognizant experiences of scarcity make the individual focus on regaining the lack of resources in the short term. And based on that, scholars have argued that this relationship should work when it comes to unethical economic behavior as well, because unethical behavior could be a way to regain that lack of resources in the short term by engaging in, for instance, more risk-taking decision-making behavior. At the current point, though, this state of the art is very, very mixed and even provides at times contradictory results. So we've seen studies suggesting that material scarcity does in fact increase unethical behavior. These are studies both on hunger, reminders of scarcity. So that is like reminders that elicit some kind of cognition related to scarcity. Studies on financial scarcity as well. And on the other hand, there's also been studies showing the direct opposite. You could say that material scarcity either does not increase unethical behavior or that it might even increase prosocial behaviors. So based on this, we wanted to investigate what is the current state of the art on does material resource scarcity actually increase the individual's inclination to engage in these unethical economic behaviors. And the way that we did that was that we pre-registered a review protocol following all of the latest PRISMA guidelines. So I can send you the link for that if you're interested. That's basically the pre-registration for all of this, which includes everything that we searched for, all of these Boolean search terms, themes, etc. And then we searched all of the 4 main scholarly databases, and also reached out to a set of research communities that we found would fit this kind of research. So for instance, Society for Personality and Social Psychology, it's one of them, to kind of, figure out if there was any kind of unpublished research on this theme. And in the end, we identified 28 articles consisting of 44 studies that were actually on the relationship on unethical economic behavior and the link to resource scarcity here. As a kind of surprise, we also found quite a few articles based on our search terms that focused on how scarcity might affect prosocial behavior. So there was, for instance, studies which both investigated unethical and prosocial behaviors, while there were also studies that only looked into prosocial behaviors. And while those basically didn't fit our pre-registration, we decided to bring those on in an additional analysis that we reported in the appendix of our paper to show whether there actually might also be an effect on prosocial behavior here and to further guide future research. And I won't be going more into this. I'll focus on the unethical part today, but we actually also found an effect here on scarcity on prosocial economic behaviors. Then moving on, we extracted basically every kind of information from these articles, all of the basic stuff on the dependent variables, independent variables, etc., and also looked into different population types, the location and site of the studies that were used, different research designs, and how participants were compensated. Based on these subgroups, we then defined, based on the independent variable, we defined 4 specific subgroups, where the first 3 of them denotes a form of acute scarcity. So that is an acute form of financial scarcity, physiological scarcity, so that could be thirst or hunger. And then these reminders of scarcity, a specific manipulations that kind of elicit cognitions related to scarcity. And then at last, we have the more chronic form of scarcity, namely social class or lower socioeconomic status. All of these effect sizes were coded based on HSG because this seems to be the standard way to go in meta-analysis and provides a little more robust and conservative estimate of the effect size incongruency. But I won't go any more into the specifics on that. Then also in regards to the methods, we suspected that quite a few of these articles that we included in here would be fairly sensitive to the context of which they were conducted in. So of course we had these classic social psych experiments using student samples. We know that that might not generalize very well, but we also had very specific lab in the field experiments, for instance, conducted with farmers in Guatemala, or there was also some from Afghanistan, etc. There's quite a few articles from around the world here. So we decided to adopt an approach suggested by Van Bavel et al. In 2016 in PNAS, which showed that contextual sensitivity, the perceived contextual sensitivity of findings, actually predicted whether or not such findings would replicate later on. And we just followed the exact same approach suggested by these authors. So we hired 3 expert coders. Those were PhD candidates who evaluated the title and the abstract of every single article that was included in the meta-analysis. So these 3 coders assessed how likely the findings were to vary by context in the form of location. So that could be like weird versus non-weird countries, sample types, difference in racial characteristics, time, stuff like this. And then they just answered to a single question saying, to what extent do you think context in the form of culture, time, place, etc., in which the study is conducted could affect the results of the study? Where 1 denotes context is not likely at all to affect the results, and 5 is that context is very likely to affect the results. All of the raters practiced this rating scheme on a set of unrelated works and then moved on to the specific 28 articles to ensure that there was consistency in the ratings. But speaking on the consistency, we actually found that we found a quite lower inter-rater reliability compared to what Van Bavel et al. Reported. So we argue that that might come as a result of 2 things. So in the original article, all of the PhD candidates were from social psychology, and all of the evaluated articles were also from social psychology. In our study here, we had articles both from economics, social psychology, marketing, etc. So we decided to also have PhD candidates from those 3 distinct disciplines, which we argue should provide a more robust perspective of this contextual sensitivity. And there might also be something here that we had quite fewer articles than what was used in the original article, which could provide a more sensitive measure of ICC here. But nevertheless, we decided to move on with this method, although we had a little lower reliability. All right, so just briefly summing up the analysis before we go into the results, we employed random effects model meta-analysis with subgroups on our study here, and because we assumed that there would be some kind of additional variation present because these studies were stemming from a series of different populations. And then we conducted what is known as graphical display of heterogeneity analysis for adjusting whether there would be any heterogeneity in the results. I'll get into that in a second. We employed a sensitivity analysis for publication bias, which was kindly suggested to us by Ricardo as another way of, or a new way as well, of evaluating publication bias. And we also did a robustness test for p-hacking by the use of a p-curve. And then at last, we looked into whether there would be any form of correlation between the study characteristics and the findings, and then our measure of perceived contextual sensitivity. But enough about all of these methods. Let's look at the results that we got. So I've been super excited to share that. This is the first time I'm talking about it. So our analysis followed this hierarchical breakdown strategy in which we initially analyzed a global model. So that's what you see denoted by all studies, before breaking them down to these subgroups. And the analysis revealed a significant overall effect size of 0.22 in terms of HSG, so corresponding to a Cohen's d as well. But this model also revealed quite substantial heterogeneity. And we did expect that priorly, because that's also what previous meta-analysis investigating dishonest behavior has found. But we decided to explore this heterogeneity by the use of this graphical display of heterogeneity analysis, which is a more sophisticated method, you could say, than this classic leave one out analysis, because we try to fit our global model and the subgroup model to all possible subsets of the data to see if there might be any specific clusters in the data accounting for this heterogeneity. And this analysis revealed that specifically 4 articles in the subgroup of financial scarcity accounted for close to 17% of the observed heterogeneity. So we adjusted the model by excluding those articles and saw here that put down our effect size estimate a little to 0.20 for the global model, but also revealed significant effect sizes for all of the subgroups except that of social class. So all of the subgroups on acute scarcity. And I've just, because this is a very large forest plot that would come from this, I've tried to cut it down over a couple of slides here. So I hope that works out well. But here's basically the subgroup on financial scarcity, showing that you could also see there's quite a lot of variation in here. And denoted by the weights over here are the articles that we decided to exclude. And as you can see, these articles also provided very, very large effect size estimates, which is why they, of course, accounted for so much of the heterogeneity in these models. Again, you see the subgroup effect estimate at 0.24. And if we move on to the social class, there is basically no effect here. What's important for me to mention here is that there are not a lot of studies on this. So all of these articles denoted by the R is basically replication attempts of a very influential article published by Physiological in 2012, which showed that higher social class would lead to more unethical behavior. So basically, this entire subgroup is Physiological and the replications of such, and then this single article by Hartman and al. But we find no significant effect on the chronic form of scarcity. Moving on to the 2 last ones is reminders of scarcity and physiological scarcity. We only have 3 studies on reminders of scarcity, all within marketing, but also showing a positive effect size and significant effect size of 0.32. And then we have these studies on physiological scarcity, which either looked into a lack of water or lack of food on the propensity to engage in unethical behavior. And overall, this results in this effect size of 0.21. As a further robustness check and to kind of further assess this relationship, we also tried fitting a mixed model with every single extracted effect size from all of the included studies. So when we evaluated these studies, we were able, for instance, to extract multiple effect sizes for a single experiment on the single relationship. And while that would kind of denote some kind of redundancy in sample sizes, we could try to fit that in a mixed model. And that confirmed our main model's pooled estimate of 0.20. So we were fairly sure that there actually is an effect here. But of course, it's important to evaluate when you look at meta-analysis is whether this literature is very sensitive to publication bias. And that's what we did with this sensitivity analysis. So a classic way to do this is to evaluate what is known as the funnel plot, a funnel plot asymmetry. And if any kind of funnel plot asymmetry exists, then you apply what is known as a trim and fill procedure to adjust the overall estimate. The problem with these methods is that they rely on an assumption that publication bias does not exist in studies that have very large point estimates. So they're not evaluated on the statistical significance, they're only evaluated on the point estimate. And contrary to this form of sensitivity analysis for publication bias estimates the extent of publication bias that is required to shift the meta-analytical estimate to 0. So it's a more straightforward way of talking about publication bias. And in our case, this sensitivity analysis estimates the n number of times, which is referred to as this S value that we have over here, that studies with significant point estimates, that's the affirmative studies over here, would need to be published compared to studies with insignificant point estimates, that's the studies over here, in order to shift the entire model estimate to 0. And our model showed that for publication bias to shift this result, affirmative studies, which there were 18 of, would need to be close to 7 times more likely to be published than non-affirmative studies. And while this is, of course, not unlikely to happen, and this can happen, we this indicates that considerable amounts of publication bias would be required to distort our findings. And we are fairly certain that publication bias does not have a material impact on our results, because actually a lot of these non-affirmative studies which reported non-significant estimates actually were published. To further assess so that's what we have here. To further assess publication bias, we also looked into this P-curve analysis. So whether this included literature would be very sensitive to data mining or p-hacking. But as you might see from the curve here, we find a significantly right-skewed P-curve, which shows that there should be no p-hacking in the current literature. So these results basically suggest that there might actually be a true effect present in the included studies, meaning that the findings cannot easily be explained through either publication bias or p-hacking. Lastly, we'll move on to the main results of our contextual sensitivity analysis. So results basically disproved our prediction that individual study characteristics would be correlated with this rated level of contextual sensitivity. We actually, in the form of base factor, provide moderate evidence of the null hypothesis being more true, namely that no correlation exists between any of these study characteristics and the contextual sensitivity. And in our paper, we argue that this conveys two messages. Basically, that the findings on the relationship between scarcity and unethical economic behavior might actually be considered fairly generalizable across contexts, also in what has been shown previously, and that the influence of contextual sensitivity in general might not be as predictive of study outcomes and future replication success, which several scholars have also argued in response to this Van Bavel article. So just to sum up the results, we find that acute experiences of financial scarcity and physiological scarcity can shift people's propensity to engage in unethical economic behavior, and that scarcity reminders can activate the same cognitions and lead to the same impact, basically. But very, very importantly, we find that more chronic forms of scarcity in the form of lower social class does not have this effect. So basically, these effects can happen across demographics and across social classes. It's of course important to note that based on the observed effects that we have and the heterogeneity observed in these models, these findings should be interpreted with some degree of caution. And it could also indicate that our models can be affected by numerous other individual traits or situational factors in the form of states that are crucial to consider when evaluating this overall relationship when motivation to engage in unethical economic behavior occurs. As I said, in regards to the publication bias, we find that our studies need to be like 7 times more likely to be published to shift this estimate to null. And if we consider previous research on publication bias, this is not unlikely to be true. But as I also said, nevertheless, that we consider that actually a lot of these studies were published, although they reported insignificant findings. We argue that it should not have a material impact on our results. Then at last, I just want to mention that we actually think that these findings could have important policy implications. So across the world of today, economic inequality has been rising, and it has been doing so for decades. And it comes with very, very destructive consequences. The problem in regards to this specific study is that policy debates often highlight economic inequality, specifically in the Western world, in order to generate an increased awareness of the problem. Our results, though, suggest that these policy debates and kind of portrays in popular culture as well might actually or could trigger unintended side effects by making this relative resource scarcity salient. Kind of scarcity reminders with negative downstream effects of individuals' propensity to engage in unethical behaviors. And that could happen across social classes and demographics. So that was it for today. Last, I would just like to thank a couple of people. So this is joint work with Panos and Lene from Aarhus University and Tobias Otterbrink, my former supervisor, who's now at University of Agder in Norway. I could not have carried out this project without these people. And I also would like to thank two of the most talented research assistants I've ever worked with. That is Frederik Munch from economics at AU and Sebastian Scott-Ingen at cognitive science. And lastly, I also need to thank my three fantastic colleagues who coded all of the studies for contextual sensitivity. That is Simon Kark from Department of Management, Caroline Kjær Børsting from Department of Management, and Jakob Dalgaard Christensen from economics at SLU. That was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. Beautiful presentation. So, for seed funding projects at IMC, it's definitely not a disadvantage to be able to engage with a new team and a team that spans across faculties, etc. And it's really interesting to see how you have done it here. And there is also new research coming out in Nature that suggests that kind of novel teams in itself seems to be predictive of interesting new results. So kind of another argument for pursuing the way that you did here. I have a number of questions, but others have questions as well. Carsten is the first one who raises his hand.
Yes, thank you. Fantastic presentation, Christian, and fantastic project. Really interesting findings, and all just really solid all the way around. I have one question about the effort coding. So it was something. The question was something about whether you thought that the context could influence the results, but that could potentially both be influence the results sort of in one direction or the other direction. So I'm just wondering whether I sort of misunderstood that, or whether you can see my point. That is it. I'm just wondering whether it was slightly ambiguous how this is supposed to be coded.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know what's happened to my video.
We can hear you. That's fine.
Okay, so I'll just talk instead. I might have a bit of a problem with my video. So these contextual sensitivity ratings were assessed on how likely the findings were to vary in future replications of the papers. So if these were to be replicated in a different context, how likely would you think that these context cues were to influence the findings, basically?
Yeah, and I mean, that does make a lot of sense. I'm just wondering also, given the results that you get, I mean, a low score could both indicate that sort of the findings would be much stronger elsewhere, or the findings could be much weaker elsewhere. I'm not saying you should have coded things differently. That was just a thought that I had.
Yeah, I would also say that another way that this probably should be assessed is, for instance, to use these, we've seen these large crowdsourced replicability indexes for like having thousands of academics rate studies for replicability. And that could be another way to do this, of course, but that was simply just beyond the scope of the current criteria. Yeah.
Christian, we have somehow lost your camera or your picture. It's okay.
Yeah, I don't know what's happened. I can't seem to start it. I'm trying the best I can, but
don't worry, you will be the dark shadow for now. I think it's really interesting finding. So I wonder, this social class thing, across your different papers, does that reflect the same thing? So for instance, if you look at a Danish context, for instance, then social class and economic ability does not necessarily correlate with each other. So I just wonder, what is social class kind of a proxy for, if not scarcity?
Yeah, so I don't know if we can say that. So basically in all of these papers, they talk about social class, then they talk about socioeconomic status, basically, right? And previous findings have argued that being aware of your lack of resources in the form of a lower social class corresponds to scarcity. But it doesn't seem that it elicits the same effects in these experiments, at least. So there might be something going on there. There's been studies showing, for instance, that people who live with lower social class are more aware of their context to which they live in. So they're more prosocial towards their peers, because they know that working together with their peers is a way of getting a better life outcome. So that if you have a higher social class, you're more individualistic because you'll survive, right? And that's been one argumentation for it, and why we also see all of these effects on low social class and prosocial behaviors, because you simply need to be aware of your family and friends, because you account for those when you live your life, basically, and try to receive better life outcomes.
I wonder, is there any way that these kind of, you can say, this subjective experience of scarcity can somehow be factored into whatever kind of proper studies that you'll be doing? Also because the cases that you started out with in terms of, the super cheating among the very rich, I'm sure they can experience that they are in a situation of scarcity, although it may not look like that from the outside. So maybe there are ways that you could open up this question of scarcity as, an experience relative to others, right? Because it might, more than anything else, really have to do with what your peers are doing. And certainly having an old car can feel like a strong sense of not being up to standards if you are in the right environment, right?
Especially, and that's also what I think is the key thing in this research, is that it isn't necessarily a lack of resources. It's a lack of resources compared to others, right? Or compared to that standard that you need to reach. And that's what's important here. And that holds across social classes. That's what we see here. So that's very, very important to carry on with. And also what we'll try to test in this laboratory experiment in regards to hunger, basically.
Great. I will share in the chat afterwards a paper by a historian who tries to come up with a biocultural explanation for the phenomenon of hoarding. So the idea that you just need more resources to come close to you. It's not necessarily a great paper, but he's kind of really arguing the point that this particular kind of instance that you feel as if you need more and more resources need to be interpreted in a framework like that. And I think, Panos, you might like that as well, but I'll throw it in the chat once I get around to it.